So this week we're looking at codes of ethics for engineers. I think that if we connect this week's discussion with last week's, that as far as the readings go, we're more or less taking Sighart's position on the idea of a profession, because I think if you think about it, the very existence of a code of ethics for a profession assumes that, well, that first of all there is a useful distinction that's made by the term professional and profession, and then secondly that professionals do have certain special ethical duties, or that they have responsibilities which go along with being professional, which are distinct again from the common run of moral duties that we have as ordinary people, which I think is what Downey was partly arguing against. So we're looking at the codes of ethics, then assuming that that engineering is a profession, I guess, and that it brings along with it certain ethical duties. But there the problem begins. I mean, we can say that there is something called professional ethics, and we can say that there is a special professional ethics for engineers, but then saying just what that is, or whether or not an official code of ethics for an engineering society actually is a good idea, those are different questions. So looking at the ASCE Code of Ethics, I think is a good idea. I mean, it's not easy to read a code of ethics. That's why I gave you a sort of extensive set of study questions to go along with it. You sort of analyze it and perhaps, first of all, getting used to the structure of it, trying to understand why it's divided up into principles, canons, and then the more detailed sections, I think is important. I asked you in the study questions, what those terms mean. I think they're principles, canons, and guidelines for practice. I hope that you thought about those things. The idea of principles, that principles are the first things. Principles are the fundamental assumptions in anything. That like in a deductive system, you have to start somewhere, and you have to start with things that you can't actually prove, so you try to start with things that you don't need to prove. So principles are supposed to be, I guess, the most fundamental, self-evidently valid statements that you can make, and that's the idea of the principles here, is that somehow or another those would be uncontroversial, that those would be ideals for engineers. The word canon is also interesting. A canon is an instrument or a standard or criterion by which other things are evaluated or compared, which makes a lot of sense, in the sense that these are the canons. These are the things that we refer to when trying to evaluate an ethical situation. They're the standards or criteria by which actions are judged to be either ethical or unethical. And guidelines for practice, I guess, is fairly self-evident. Now, if we look at the fundamental canons, I guess when you do the readings, you'll see that one of the issues that comes up continually in discussion of engineering codes of ethics is the relation between the canon, the hold paramount canon, hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public, and the faithful agent or trustee canon, which exhorts engineers to be faithful agents of their employers or clients. If we look at Luganbiel's critical essay on codes of ethics, in which he doesn't say that there shouldn't be any engineering ethics by any means, but that the idea of an actual code of rules is a bad idea. And one of the reasons, one of the fundamental reasons that he says so is because he sees that there's a contradiction between those two things, those two canons. There's a contradiction between being told to hold paramount, that is, to put above all else the health, safety, and welfare of the public, and on the other hand, to be a faithful agent or trustee of an employer or client. because those things may not be compatible. That is, it may not be possible to do both at the same time. And under his reading, and I don't think he was looking at the ASCE code. There's so many codes of ethics for engineers, and an interesting part of his essay, Luganbiehl's essay, is his history of that. You know, his history of how and why engineering ethical codes came about, the way that they've been constantly revised. It's a very interesting history because it gives you a peek into the history of the development of the profession. But his idea is that these two canons don't lead to any kind of satisfactory answer for the engineer. That is, just by using these rules as a guideline for action, there's no clear outcome. That is, the code does not offer a coherent solution to many problems. That is, whether, for instance, an engineer can engage in whistleblowing, whether an engineer can reveal proprietary information in whistleblowing, would seem to present a dilemma, because on the one hand, the engineer is called upon to hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public. On the other hand, the engineer is expected to be a faithful agent or trustee. This seeming contradiction, I don't know if it is, but Luganbiehl thinks it is, between these two canons, is a very deep thing. I think in my developing knowledge of engineering and of the history of the profession and of the history of the codes, this is a very deep issue. That is, whether the primary duty and loyalty of the engineer is to the public, or whatever that means, or to the employer or client, especially the employer, given the fact that so many engineers are employees of corporations. That issue of what is more important and is incredibly important for the profession. Looking at Davis's essay, Thinking Like an Engineer, which is basically a justification of engineering codes. Now, Luganbiehl doesn't want to do away with any kind of ethical instruction for engineers. He wants to do away with the codes. The idea that you can somehow have a collection of rules that will be useful for engineers in resolving moral situations. He wants to replace those with guides for practice, which is actually part of the ASCE code, but maybe not what he had in mind. But Davis is much more supportive of the idea of codes, and although he may not really be contradicting anything Luganbiehl says, in that justification of codes is very interesting. His characterization of what a professional code of ethics is, a convention between professionals, and how it, having a code of ethics is in fact a very useful thing. And he starts that essay with the example of the Challenger disaster and the situation that this Morton Fikal engineer was in which I think we'd all agree that this guy made the wrong decision in agreeing under pressure to okay the launch of the space shuttle. I mean, it was obviously the wrong decision. But the question was, what would have made this guy or led him to make the right decision? The wrong decision was a result, Davis suggests, of him thinking like a manager, whereas perhaps the right decision would have been arrived at if he was thinking like an engineer. But then the question is, what does it mean to think like an engineer? Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, I don't know. I'm not an engineer. But one of the questions that he raises is the issue of, engineers work with things, and then they solve technical problems. What sort of ethical connection really is there? Thinking about it, I think that Davis arrives at something like an endorsement of the hold paramount canon. That is the idea that and Luganbiel suggests this too, that protecting the public, and in this case the public is anybody who is sort of an innocent, but is anybody who stands to be affected by the project, whatever the project is, who is not involved in the actual doing and carrying out of the project. That is somebody who's vulnerable. In this case, I would say the astronauts who were killed constituted the public. That's if you're thinking like an engineer, Davis suggests, you're thinking that your primary duty is to them. That you're thinking that, you know, whatever your loyalties, duties are to your client or employer, that they are outweighed by your duty to the public. This is an easy thing to say, I think, but in practice sometimes a difficult thing to do. And you know, that is to hold paramount the safety of the public would seem to be axiomatic for engineers. That is to do no harm, which is, you know, relates it to the code of ethics for doctors, but that's not so easy in concrete circumstances, given the pressures, and certainly it wasn't easy for this guy from Morton Thiokol, Robert Lund, who was seemingly, I mean, we can imagine, under tremendous pressure to okay this launch, despite his misgivings, his technical misgivings as an engineer. Oh, that's where codes of ethics come in. You know, Davis's idea is that this convention between professionals is something that does enable ethical behavior. Why? Because if there is an official code of ethics, that is, we're not just relying on what he calls private conscience, then we know that we can expect other engineers who are also beholden to the same code of ethics to support us in our decisions. That is, not to take advantage of us, to back us up when we clearly are following the code and when we refuse to break the code. So really the existence of a code of ethics is good for everyone, and especially for engineers. Why? Because it enables them, I think what he's saying is it enables them to do the right thing. That is, it facilitates doing the right thing. Where, in defense of one's position, for instance, in a situation like Lund was in, Davis suggests he could have simply said, well, you can't ask me to think like a manager rather than an engineer. I have to think like an engineer. I am an engineer, and this is what engineers think like. This is how we think. And if you don't like it, get somebody else. And the code of ethics is something that can back up that assertion, that refusal to do anything else but think like an engineer. Why? Because there's an official code of ethics. It's public, and other engineers can be expected to know it, follow it, and back up people who insist upon it being followed. So for Davis, I think the code of ethics is a very important thing. So in any case, there are questions of codes, you know, about the validity of codes. Luganbiel raises some interesting issues about possible contradictions in the code. He also raises some interesting issues about individual moral autonomy. You know, the idea that it is impermissible, really, to impose moral principles on people and expect them to follow them as the code does. That, you know, the very idea of morality is that those principles have to be self-chosen, and that you know, there are certain things you can expect of somebody simply because they're members of the profession. For instance, education, you know, certain you know, let's say non-moral things, but you can't impose moral or ethical things on people. That's an interesting question, you know, whether the codes of ethics themselves are an intrusion on your moral autonomy and your sort of right to choose, you know, your own moral beliefs.